second point. Now, the recycling of the logic of historical necessity has taken on a more philosophical turn with the recycling of one of the main theses of the Communist Manifesto, the thesis of the dissolution of all solid structures and traditional forms. All that is solid melts into the air. The well-known sentence of the Communist Manifesto has become the slogan of the numerous versions of postmodern manifestos that have blossomed at the beginning of the 80s to describe how everything from the conditions of work to the strokes of military forces was becoming more and more immaterial, liquid, or ethereal. The most accomplished form of this narrative can be found in the work of a German philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk, who made himself both the thinker and the historian of this becoming aerial of our world. So he describes the process of modernity as a process of anti-gravitation. Anti-gravitation first refers, of course, to the technical inventions that allow men to conquer space and fly in the air. But more generally, it tells us that life has lost much of its gravity, which means both its weight of poverty, pain, or toughness, and its weight of reality. In his view, our affluent society is definitely released from what he calls, quote, the definitions of reality formulated by the ontology of poverty. And yet, we still cling to those formulas and phrase the lack of misery and the lack of gravity in the language of misery and gravity. So we experience, he says, the contrary of the process described by Marx. Instead of projecting into an ideal sky the inverted reality of the earthly misery, our contemporaries project into an illusory solid reality the inverted image of that process of escape. Well, this sketching of a light and word I'm evoking is one among many, many discourses, half melancholic, half cynical descriptions of a social world turned into the global reign of a petty bourgeoisie of narcissistic individuals. All those descriptions urge us to confess that all our desires, including our dreams of subversion, are fancies, allowing us to indulge in the new game available on the global market, experimenting one's life as a luxury commodity. But at this point, and this is my third point, the melancholic and or cynical view of the reign of narcissism is taken over by a less cheerful discourse, the discourse on the triumph of the commodity and the spectacle. Well, in a sense, it's only the continuation of the critical discourse of the 60s, denouncing the mythologies of the commodity, the fallacies of consumer society, and the empire of the spectacle. But 40 years ago, this criticism was supposed to provide anti-capitalist fighters with new weapons. It has slowly turned to exactly the contrary, a form of nihilist knowledge of the reign of the commodity and the spectacle, of the equivalence of anything with anything, and of anything with its image. That nihilist wisdom features the entire mankind as a population of idiots fascinated by the spectacle of TV reality shows and merry consumers overfilling all bins with the refuse of their frantic consumption. It pictures the law of domination as a force that permeates any will to do anything against it. Ultimately, the logic of the denunciation is entirely overturned. It was aimed once at showing how the capitalist machine could cheat those who were submitted to its power. Now it tells us that the empire of the machine is only the product of the frenetic desire of those individuals to consume still more commodities, spectacles, and forms of self-enjoyment. So the guilt of the system has become the guilt of the individuals that are subjected to it. And capitalism is said to be no more than the reign of mass individualism or democratic individualism. Now, and I come to the fourth point, this criticism has taken a step further to persuade us that those narcissistic consumers of commodities, spectacles, etc., are responsible not only for the reign of the market, but also for the totalitarian destruction of the symbolic order structuring any human community. This is still another interesting case of reversal of the old oppositions. 50 years ago, the dominant discourse in the Western world opposed the democratic freedoms of the individuals to collective totalitarianism. And in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet system was hailed in the Western world as the triumph of democracy, viewed as human rights plus free market plus free individual choice. But curiously, in the following years, and notably in France, I must say, what happened was quite surprising. A lot of sociologists, political philosophers, and moralists began to explain us that democracy and the rights of man, as Marx approved it, were merely the rights of the egoistic bourgeois individual. So, and in our time, the rights of the consumers to any kind of consumption. A right that pushed them, they say, to overstep all limits to their thirst for consumption, thereby to destroy all the traditional institutions and forms of authority, imposing a limit to the power of the market, such as family, school, or religion. This is, they said, what democracy means in fact, the power of the individual consumer who cares for nothing but the satisfaction of his or her needs and desire. Therefore, they concluded that this so-called democratic individual wants only the triumph of the market in all the spheres of life, hence the destruction of all forms of traditional authority and transmission that constitute a symbolic order. So when the, when the World Trade Center was destroyed, a well-known French psychoanalyst and professor of Roman law explained in a leading French newspaper that the attack was the return of the repressed in Western civilization. It was a castigation for the Western overthrow of the symbolic order, an overthrow emblematized for him by same-sex marriage. 2 years after, a French linguist and philosopher gave a more radical turn to that interpretation in a book entitled The Criminal Tendencies of Democratic Europe. The crime that he imputed to democratic Europe was quite simply the extermination of the European Jews. As the Jewish people, he says, faithful to the law of kinship and transmission, it stood up as the only obstacle to the democratic desire of unlimitedness. That's why democracy had to exterminate the Jews and was the only beneficiary of their extermination. In such a way, the criticism of the market, consumer society, and the spectacle ends up denouncing the so-called democratic individual, whose thirst for consumption is blamed for all the evils in the contemporary world. The conclusion, of course, is that state powers and economic powers had better make their decisions without consulting those irresponsible individuals. But that's not the whole picture. According to this logic, the most dangerous democratic consumers are first those who have the less money for consumption, and second, those who rebel against the empire of exploitation and consumption.